violence at the polls as inherently evil, when people in the pre-Civil War years saw that as standard. That was the way politics worked, and that wasn't something to be ashamed of, and that wasn't something you'd get arrested for.
Gangs would pay voters to grow a beard before Election Day, then vote, shave several times, and vote several more times as their appearances changed.
What the Democratic organization wanted was your vote. We need that. And of course it gave you self-respect, because in Ireland, or later in Italy or Eastern Europe, if you were poor, nobody at the top of the social or political hierarchy in the old world gave a hoot what you thought about anything. You were scum.
So they started catering to the Irish vote at a time when other political bodies were scorning the Irish. The Irish had not previously been courted until they were courted by Tammany.
New York in the 19th century was corrupt from the top down to the bottom. Pickpockets were commonplace, and many of them were children, any of the estimated 10,000 to 30,000 children who lived on the streets, orphaned or abandoned. Child labor practices were brutal, and crime was often a necessary means of survival. Many young women perfected the art of pickpocketing, and they were the most daring.
Many young women worked as pickpockets. Pickpocketing was a very important trade at the time, when you had a lot of rich people walking around, and in those days without credit cards, hence carrying, significant amounts of cash. And who better to pick the pocket of a rich man, especially in a public place, than a comely young woman?
And naturally, where there were men, there were women. They stuck close to the gangs in a sort of women's auxiliary. Women like the legendary character called Hellcat Maggie.
Yes, apparently there was a character named Hellcat Maggie who wore artificial, brass fingernails with which she used to scratch out the eyes of adversaries. And she kept a jar of ears on her bar, where she worked as a bouncer.
The 5 Points is an area where women fought, and there's lots of arrests of women in the 5 Points. And whether some of the fantastic stories of harpies with filed teeth are certainly exaggerations, they were involved in it. And a lot of the fighting involved throwing stuff out of people's windows. They called that Irish confetti, and it came right out of your house.
As rough as life was in the streets of Manhattan, it could still get worse. With the approach of the Civil War, all hell would break loose. New York City, like the nation, would be ripped apart by the Civil War. And in the city, gangs helped incite mob violence. It is a shameful chapter in the city's history, often forgotten. Here, a war would be fought in the streets by citizens gone mad. By 1863, the war was 2 years old, and the Union was suffering heavy losses.
By 1863, it was obvious that the Civil War is not some kind of a party. This is a horrible bloodletting. It's people dying in very large numbers, and the people who aren't dying, their legs are being sawed off, and they're permanently maimed, and it's just horrible.
Many breadwinners were lost, and New Yorkers were deeply suspicious of how the war would benefit them in the end. Fears of competition for work with even more newly freed slaves were smoldering.
African Americans were being used as strikebreakers. They were being brought in past these jeering crowds, very often Irishmen, and they were being escorted by federal troops.
Irish immigrants who weathered the dangerous journey to America were asked to die for the anti-slavery cause as soon as they got off the boat. In 1863, President Lincoln called for a draft of 300,000 men. It was the first draft ever held. Name after name were pulled out of a lottery wheel, kindling resentment amongst working men. A deeply unfair clause in the law lit the match.
The draft is instituted, and the draft, of course, had this incredible provision that if you could pay $300, you could pay for a substitute to go for you. So the crowd saw this as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight.
In July, 2 days after the draft began, riots erupted.
Competing fire companies throughout New York City, who were kind of quasi-gangs in themselves, One of them was called the Black Joke Fire Company, and one of their members was drafted when the draft started on July 11th. And when the riot starts on July 13th, it's the Black Joke Fire Company that shows up to start it.
Volunteer firemen set the draft station on fire. Soon, the entire city was embroiled in the protest.
The draft riots in New York in 1863 are not contained. They spill all over the city. Police are fighting uptown and downtown. The army is coming in on 1st Avenue. There are riots on 8th Avenue. There's a sense throughout the whole city that every part of the city is threatened. And the federal government is very afraid of losing control of the city, that it's going to be in the control of the mobs.
An estimated 70,000 rioters took to the streets and would terrorize Manhattan for the better part of a week.
This isn't sporadic looting with the police shooting at people. This is people shooting from rooftops. This is people behind barricades. The streets are barricaded. It has the feel of a revolution as much as a riot.
Mobs mutilated, tortured, and killed policemen.
It was a carnival of rioting, and it was not in any way particularly directed. It seemed to be spontaneous, but it was headless and tailless and resulted really only in death and destruction.
African Americans were especially targeted with ferocious cruelty as the mob vented its rage.
The draft riots were probably the worst episode in the entire history of the African American community in New York, because blacks were simply hunted down in the streets, often lynched from the nearest lamppost or tree.
Some of the killings, lynchings of black people were almost ritualistic in their character. Dragging is one incident of a black man who was dragged through the streets by a rope attached to his genitals. Police would come by, cut down a body that had been hanging from a lamppost, and then when the police left, they'd hang it back up again.
Mobs even stormed and burned an orphanage, the Colored Orphan Asylum, and one little girl was killed. Hundreds of other children were evacuated and brought to a barge on the river for protection.
What does that tell us about the degree of anger and hatred at the time that you could destroy an orphanage? I mean, that you would think some places would be off limits, a monastery or something like that. You know, these people are out of the fray, but they didn't regard it as out of the fray, and they burned it anyways.
Mobs took the 21st Street Armory and set it on fire, killing many rioters caught inside. It rained the first night of the riots, which may have stopped the lower part of Manhattan from burning to the ground. A Colonel Henry O'Brien attempted to subdue the rioters and was tortured by the mob and killed by members of a Five Points gang. The rioters took over the Union Steamworks, garrisoning the plant with 500 men. The governor of New York declared the city to be in a state of insurrection. The crowds only grew more brazen. One mob tried to storm the offices of the Tribune, the newspaper that had thrown the most support behind the Civil War.